When I made my way to the courthouse that morning, I was under the impression that there was nothing unusual that awaited me there. I led a straightforward life as a grandmother, a mother, and a woman in every respect. As soon as I walked in the door, Dawn, my daughter, immediately turned her head away from me and said something to her husband, Dave, who was sitting next to her. Even though I was cognizant of the fact that what I had just said was not particularly kind, I decided to disregard it. The sole reason that my presence was able to be traced back to me was that I had been summoned there. My being at that location was not due to any intention of causing a disruption. I did not have any awareness that this battle, this juncture in time, would eventually result in a total metamorphosis of all things. The moment that the judge looked up from his notes, the color immediately drained from his face. For a very short amount of time, I perceived a flash of acknowledgement in his eyes. It was as though a recollection had arisen from within him. After that point in time had passed, he persisted in maintaining the same level of immobility as previously. He made a point of ensuring that everyone who was present in the courtroom could hear what he had to say when he added, "That's her." There was not a single sound that could be made out in the room, which was utterly devoid of noise. It was the kind of silence that gives the impression that there is something being held back by somebody. It was as though the entire environment was saturated with a substantial burden. Despite the fact that I had not done anything to deserve it in any whatsoever, I had the unavoidable impression that I was the main focus of the attention of every single person around me. Not a single one of them opened their mouths to speak a single word for an extended period of time. They kept their quiet without interruption. For the first time, I had the sensation that he was genuinely paying attention to me. This was the first time I had ever felt this way. I knew that he was aware of me in a way that was different from everyone else in the room. The minute that consciousness came crashing in like a tidal wave, everything would be permanently changed in the blink of an eye. "I'm Maeve, how do you do?" "I'm doing well. How can I help you today?" "I'm doing all okay. What is it that I can do for you on this day?" As of right now, I am 86 years old. Simply a few months ago, I was simply an average grandmother living a quiet, everyday life. In the past, people did things that way. I would awaken from my sleep every morning at 6 o'clock, prepare my coffee in the chipped mug that had been my companion for the last 20 years, and give my African violets a drink of water. The flowers were the last surviving link that I had to my deceased husband. They caused me to feel a sense of connectedness to him. I took it upon myself to save them so that they would go on living in his honor. I took it upon myself to ensure that they would continue living in his honor because he had passed away from home. I lived a life that was straightforward and easy to predict. It was more than adequate for the task that lay before of it, despite the fact that it did not possess any of the bells and whistles that are typically associated with items of this kind. I gave up every facet of my life for the sake of my daughter, Dawn. I refrained from working at night for 45 years so that I could clean offices, bake cupcakes on weekends, and sew clothes in order to generate extra income. She was in charge of everything that happened during that time. She would have the capability to live a lifestyle that has escaped me my entire life. In order for her to continue her schooling and go on her career path, thereby creating a bright future for herself. She was, as far as I could see, the single most important item and person in my life. It has always been my firm belief that our relationship would survive for a long time and that our need for each other's support would only get greater as time went on. Every direction I looked was full of naivete, and I lacked experience. I had pinned my hopes on him becoming a different person after she married him, as I have never been a particularly big supporter of Dave in the first place. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that he will grow into the type of man who is capable of experiencing the same feelings of love for her that I experience. This did not materialize in the long term despite all of these efforts. On the contrary, his feelings of arrogance and contempt have increased to a degree that is significantly larger than what they were earlier. Following that, Dawn made her appearance in the midst of the drama. She began the process of withdrawing from my life both emotionally and physically. At first, I was of the opinion that the feelings of anxiety that she was experiencing were merely a byproduct of the fact that she was entering a new era in her life. Nevertheless, the reality of the situation eventually dawned on each of the individuals involved over the span of several months. After that event had place, she no longer wanted anything to do with me. I did not provide her with any substantial assistance in response to her pleas. More than anything else, that caused pain. After I had exhausted all of the options at my disposal in order to provide her with assistance, she rewarded my efforts by treating me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience to her. That cold, icy feeling began to become increasingly noticeable and palpable. She no longer went to visit for the same reason that she had done so in the past, because affection was no longer a motivating element for her visits. They were under an obligation to work with them and had no other recourse but to acquiesce to their desires. The excuses that she came up with in order to avoid spending time with me became increasingly imaginative, and she started to call me with less and less frequency. I well remember a certain Thursday in October, and I was under the assumption that nothing in the whole wide world could possibly go wrong. It is a dish that I remember serving her when she was younger, and it is also the dish that I have decided to prepare for her evening meal. I set aside the entire day only for the purpose of getting this particular course prepared and ready to go. Because it was her favorite meal of the day, she was eagerly anticipating it for the entire day. The only thing that would bring a smile to her face every single time was putting fresh flowers in the centerpiece and setting out the tablecloth that I had embroidered for her when she was a teenager. It was exactly that item. I did not overlook anything by accident. I double-checked to be sure that every single item had been addressed. If I was able to successfully communicate to her that I still cared for her, I assumed that she would then feel the same way about me in return. As soon as they came, Dave went into my house as if it were his own personal residence. All of his attention was purposely turned away from me. He didn't even look in my direction once. Not a single syllable escaped his lips. He approached the armchair that had previously been the property of my late husband and switched on the television without so much as uttering a single syllable. Conversely, throughout my entire life, I have never experienced a glance from Dawn that was as frigid as the one I was given on this occasion. She appeared to be in a distant place, and her facial expression remained neutral, betraying no feelings at all. At the time, I had purchased for her the green costume that she was sporting. Her voice had altered as she stated, "Mother, we need to have a conversation about something that we cannot avoid." This time, I did not hear the voice that I was familiar with. It was not the voice that I had heard from my child my entire life. I was unfamiliar with the voice since it did not belong to me. It was the voice of another person. She gave the impression that she was impatient to leave and go somewhere else by sitting on the edge of the chair. The phrases that she used, which felt like a blade slicing into me, were the comments that I observed her making as she began to talk. She drew particular attention to the phrases by making an effort to highlight them when she stated, "This matter is something on which Dave and I have reached an agreement." I was left with a lasting impression from the words that she delivered, which have left an indelible mark and continue to resonate in my ears. "This residence is too massive for you to handle single-handedly anymore, seeing as how you are no longer big enough to manage it by yourself. We will be searching for a larger location to call home as soon as we become parents." I was completely taken aback when I discovered that there was a retirement community that would be the perfect fit for people of your age bracket, I stated to him during my talk with him. Dawn learned to walk in the very spot where this was. We called this place our home. It was where we resided. It was the place where we had commemorated every single birthday, as well as the location where her father had taken his last breath while he held my hand. She had an overwhelming desire to take it from me since it was something that she had a strong want to possess. This powerful longing was the reason that she wanted to take it away from me. I could sense my heart sinking deeper and deeper into my stomach as she began to speak as I continued to remain standing there. She took it upon herself to provide an explanation by saying, "Mom, the heart is where memories are kept." I implored her while my voice shook. "Not on the walls." "However, Dawn, this is our residence." She wasn't paying attention. "All of our memories are preserved in this location." It was of no concern to her. It was no longer our home at that point in time. It was simply a house, something that could be sold or exchanged, something that could be gotten rid of once it was no longer of use. With a satisfied expression on his face, Dave was sitting in my husband's chair. "For your own good, Mrs. Maeve," he added, as though he had any authority to address me in that manner. "We will handle all of the necessary paperwork." All of a sudden, my whole life came crashing down around me. But they said, "Don't worry about a thing." My kid was asking me to leave. The fact that my home was no longer mine was something she was informing me about. I did everything in my power to prevent myself from crying, despite the fact that my eyes were full with tears. Not in their presence. Not after all the things that I had done for them. I found myself unable to move from where I was standing, as I was rooted to the spot while I tried to make sense of what was going on. I was filled with great sadness as I watched the house that had been the center of our lives, the place where Dawn had grown up, and the location where my wife and I had shared so many memories together, whether through laughter, crying, or both, being taken away from me. It was my daughter, the one for whom I had made so many sacrifices, who was letting me know that it was time for me to leave. I could not comprehend what had happened to cause this situation to occur, and I could not believe it at all. How could the young woman who once gazed upon me with feelings of love and admiration have become a person who could scarcely stand to be in my presence? I searched her eyes, looking for any indication that the stranger staring back at me was the daughter that I had nurtured, but I did not find any. I found myself looking at a woman who had permitted her husband to manipulate her in order to turn her against me. Dawn continued to speak in a manner that was flat and indifferent, as if the things that were coming out of her mouth were completely commonplace. I was trying to compose myself during this time. "We have already reserved a space for you," she said. "The retirement community is beautiful. In addition to activities, they provide the services of a nurse who is available for duty at all hours of the day. You will be safer there, Mother, if you go. You will be with others who are of the same age as you." The words, "It will be a new beginning for you," he stated, caused her to feel as though she had been punched in the stomach. It was my own daughter who let me know that I was not in a position of security within the walls of my own home, and that it would be better for me to go live somewhere else, where I would be surrounded by people I do not know. For more than 30 years, I have been a tenant of that particular residence. It was in that location where I had raised her. She was now demanding that I pack up my things and leave, as though I were nothing more than a nuisance in her life, despite the fact that I had devoted my entire existence to supplying her with everything that I could and looking after her. I repressed the feelings of misery that I was experiencing because they were more than I could bear. I buried the feelings in the back of my mind. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose composure. "This is our home, Dawn," I said in a voice that was trembling. "This is the only place where all of our memories are preserved. Every single room and picture on the wall narrates the story of the life that we have built together," I whispered. I was trying to keep my voice from shaking, but I could feel my heart quicken and my hands tremble. He took my hand when he left. He passed away right here next to me. "This is where I am meant to be," I said. "This is where I want to be." However, she was not giving what I had to say any consideration. She had turned her attention totally away from me. Even though he was already casting a glance around the room with his eyes as if he were the proprietor of the place, she was nodding in agreement with everything that Dave was saying. I was overcome with queasiness. This location served as my home, but their behavior was making me feel as though they were treating it as though it were nothing more than a piece of garbage that could be discarded at any moment. She maintained her icy and aloof tone as she shifted her focus to Dawn and proclaimed, "Mother, I understand that you are going through a really difficult time right now. However, it is the best thing for everyone else. There is no way that you are going to be able to stay in the same house as you are now. And as Dave and I start growing our family, we are going to require more space." I felt a great want to scream, "You can't do this by yourself anymore." I wanted to make her understand the extent of the sacrifices I had made for her and the things I had given up in order to ensure that she had the kind of life that I never had. Rather of uttering even a single word, I stood there in silence, giving the terrible weight of the things that she had uttered all the time it required to fully register. "You do not understand, do you? You have no idea how important this house is to me," I whispered, making sure that my voice was loud enough to be heard. Dawn, on the other hand, turned her gaze away from me and adopted an expression that was as cold and rigid as stone. She had come to a decision with respect to the matter. At that precise moment in time, I became fully aware of the fact that I had driven her away from me. I discovered that I was not even able to protect myself, which was more disturbing to me than anything else. I lacked the essential amount of fortitude. She is not a formidable adversary for her in any manner or fashion. There is nothing that I have against Dave. I was advanced in age, have very little strength, and was so invisible that it was as if I did not exist in the world. They possessed a thorough understanding of the actual state of affairs. They were well aware of the fact that I did not have the authority to prevent them from doing the things that they were doing. I had the impression that I could perceive it. It was as if there was a weight that was pressing down on my chest. Despite all this, I continued to have a positive outlook on the situation, holding on to the belief that Dawn would finally come to the realization of what it was that she was doing. She would be reminded of the mother who had reared her and who had loved her without placing any restrictions on her love, and she would eventually come to see the way in which she had been behaving. Despite all of this, that hope began to dissipate as time went on, and I eventually reached the conclusion that I was no longer a member of her life. All I was a nuisance that needed to be dealt with in some way. For the next several days, I was completely overwhelmed and did not know what to do. Prior to hiring an expert who evaluates the worth of real estate, Dave neglected to provide me with any advance warning. It was as if this man were looking at my house as if it were just another property for sale. He glanced all around the interior of my home. He made a note of the measurements of the rooms, recorded the dimensions of the rooms, and commented on all of the problems that the house was experiencing. When he took a glance around the kitchen, he remarked, "Those pipes date back to a significantly earlier time period. Those tiles in the kitchen are no longer considered fashionable." I was standing in the kitchen listening to him talk about my home as if it were a commodity when he made the comment, "If you want to sell this place, you're going to have to replace everything." I felt as though my insides were being torn apart. These tiles were not simply tiles of the typical variety. These pipes were not simply average or commonplace pipes. It was my husband who personally put his hands to the installation of these types of artifacts in the residence. My partner, who had put in a great deal of time and energy into this place and with whom I had built a life here. And now, all of it was being reduced to nothing more than garbage that would be discarded. While the appraiser was speaking, he did not even look in my way once. The fact that I was present was completely ignored by him. I got the feeling that I wasn't there at all. Dawn gave her assent to all that he stated as she stood by his side, nodding her head in accord. She maintained a face that was utterly devoid of any emotion whatsoever. Following the completion of his examination of the space, he made the statement, "The flooring in the living room is going to need to be replaced." After that, he went on to say, "The windows will also need to be replaced." When he made the comment, "It's going to cost a lot of money," Dawn did not utter a single word in response. She did not speak a single word in response and continued to listen to him as though she thought that every word that he said was the absolute truth. She did not give the memories that were housed within those walls any importance. As far as she was concerned, the history of the house did not matter in the slightest. She was simply worried about getting rid of it and continuing on with her life. Going to get pamphlets about the senior living complex was the most challenging moment Dawn had to endure. She raised a glossy brochure that had pictures of beautiful gardens and senior citizens with grins on their faces as they played bingo and said, "Take a look at this, Mom. Everything that one might possibly require is offered at this place. Additionally, there is a nurse on duty 24 hours a day, so you will be protected." When I first heard it, I was completely taken aback. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was attempting to convince me to give up my house, my life, and everything that I had known for 30 years in order to migrate to a sterile, faceless environment where I would be just another resident, just another number. I said to Dawn with a voice that was shaking, "This has nothing to do with safety. I have never had any problems since I have been living in this place for many years. I reside at this location. This is where I belong." She returned my gaze with a grin, but it was a phony smile, one that was empty, and it made my stomach turn. She made a comment saying, "Mother, if you do this, you will be in a more advantageous position. You can trust me." I was no longer considered to be a part of her familial circle. I was nothing more than a riddle that was just waiting to be solved. In order for her to move on with her life, I was an issue that needed to be dealt with. I was not certain if the agony that I was experiencing was a result of her trying to convince me that this plan was a good one, or whether it was a result of my knowledge that she had already decided to follow through with this notion. Dave extended invitations to a number of visitors to come to the house, and once they arrived, he had the property evaluated and measured. They talked about the upgrades and the essential repairs as if I was not even in the room at that moment. I was able to hear them talking from the room next door. They were discussing the amount of money they would be able to make from the property and what the value of the house would be when they had finished making the necessary modifications. They were treating it as if it were a transferable good, something that could be bought and sold, and I was being destroyed by it within. I found myself unable to resist pondering the look on my daughter's face. Her cold words continued to replay in my thoughts like a melody that would not let me alone. She had taken to repeating the phrase, "Mother, it's for the best," over and over again, as though saying it again were somehow going to make it come true. On the other hand, this was not actually the situation. Not a single element of it was accurate in any way. I was not ready to let go just yet. I was not at all prepared to be addressed in such an offhand manner. When I got up the following morning, I had a feeling of emptiness. The quiet that pervaded the home was more suffocating than it had ever been before. It was the sort of quiet that presses down on you and makes it difficult to take a breath. I went through my usual procedure, but it seemed to be different than it had in the past. I had never experienced anything like it before. Everything felt different. I prepared my coffee, but it didn't taste the same as usual. I made certain that my African violets were getting enough water. Nevertheless, I no longer derived the same sense of comfort from the process of caring for them as I did in the past. I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that everything had disintegrated so rapidly. It was quite easy for my own daughter to abandon me. She had come to the conclusion that there was nothing unusual at all about the idea of getting rid of me. She had accepted the concept so quickly that it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. And Dave too. The mere notion of him was enough to prevent me from doing it. It was the actions of the man who had imparted to my daughter the conviction that I was an impediment to her, that I was a bother in her life. He had gone about the business so quietly and unobtrusively that I had not been aware that it was taking place. Anxiety and uneasiness plagued the days that followed after that day. Dawn made a lower number of visits than she had made in the past. She would always show up in a hurry, and she would always have a cause to leave earlier than she had anticipated whenever she did show up. With each passing day, I had the impression that she was keeping her distance from me and withdrawing more and more. I had pinned all my hopes, at the very least, on the fact that she would reconsider her decision. She would eventually come to the conclusion that the degree to which she was inflicting suffering on me was the same as the degree to which she was inflicting suffering on herself. On the other hand, she became much more withdrawn than she had been previously. The same thing may be stated for Dave. He stopped by on several occasions under the pretense that he was checking on things, but he always had the same satisfied expression on his face, as if he were the one who was in charge of the situation. His behavior seemed to suggest that he had come out on top in the end. That which they were oblivious to, though, was the fact that I did not lack as much power as they had imagined I did. People had the misconception that I was feeble like an elderly person, but this was not the case. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the armchair that my husband used to use after I had an especially intense dispute with Dawn. Many quiet moments had been spent together by us in the same chair in which he had taken his final breath. I looked around the room carefully and made a mental note of everything in it, no matter how small. I was unable to realize the full amount of the extent to which things had gone awry because of the photographs that decorated the walls, the antique furniture, and the bookcases that were bursting with souvenirs. My daughter, the child to whom I had given everything, had somehow become an individual who had the capacity to treat me in such a way. Despite the fact that the pain was so severe that it seemed as though it would be impossible to overcome, I was unable to let myself get entirely consumed by the agony of it all. For a long time I had been giving in to other people. For an excessive amount of time, I put aside my own happiness for the well-being of my family. On the other hand, this is no longer accurate. I was not going to allow them to take anything away from me. I would not let them take away my dignity, my memories, or my home without putting up a fight first. Early the next morning, I arrived at a conclusion. I was not going to let this go by without repercussions of some kind. Signing the documents was something that I did not want to do at all. I was resolved to remain there until I engaged in a physical altercation. I had spent the entire night pondering it and went over every possible angle that had come to mind after giving the matter considerable attention. I didn't stand to lose anything else at the time. Be that as it may, I was in possession of a secret, something that they had not foreseen. A secret that my husband left behind for me, one that had the power to change everything. The knowledge had been in his grasp prior to that point in time. He possessed a complete understanding of the events that were taking place as well as the abilities that Dave possessed. In order to make sure that I would be protected, he had taken all of the required preparations. I would have the capacity to defend myself once the moment arrived. It had remained hidden away for years until it was discovered in the form of a document that is known as a will. A will that had just come into my possession a few days prior to that point, and that had the power to completely transform my life. I recall getting to my feet and being overcome by a sensation of motivation and determination. I had the sense that I could finally breathe freely again, which had not happened for several weeks. I was not going to allow them to get the upper hand on me. I was not going to allow them to take away from me my home, my legacy, or my life. From what I could tell, I was in the driver's seat. I was not the vulnerable young woman that they had thought me to be. I was not the senile, forgotten mother who could be easily discarded. I had a lot of strength at my disposal. I was the person who had the power to make decisions. My intention was to make use of it too. I put all of the paperwork together, keeping in mind that I was willing to take on the obligation of bearing its entire weight, even if the burden of it all was considerable. I vividly recall holding the letter that carried the final desires of my husband in my trembling hands. I waited patiently for the opportune occasion to present itself before bringing the issue up to their attention. It was not a simple task in the slightest. I would do my best to talk myself into the idea that it was necessary for me to move on and that I needed to let go every morning at dawn. On the other hand, I was no longer giving it any thought at that point in time. I had turned a blind eye to it, not after witnessing the facts for myself. I was able to perceive the stress that was mounting as soon as I witnessed the first signs of fractures beginning to manifest themselves in the facade that they had built. They had reached the conclusion that I was under their control and that they possessed the authority to exercise that power. They were under the delusion that they would be able to convince me to abandon everything that I had fought for and worked for. They were continuing to operate, on the other hand, under assumptions that were not true. That day had eventually come to pass. As soon as Dawn and Dave arrived at the house, they were under the impression that I would be ready to sign the forms and depart immediately. On the other hand, I still wasn't prepared at that point in time. I had one last trump card up my sleeve. I still had one final piece of the puzzle that I had yet to uncover. The moment that they walked in, Dave began speaking in his usual tone of voice that came out as patronizing. "Mrs. Maeve, this is a subject that we have already discussed. There are no additional subjects that will be discussed." He pronounced the words at a slow and deliberate pace, enunciating each individual syllable with a great deal of emphasis. "And everything will be taken care of as soon as we receive your signature," I said. I turned my gaze back to him and locked eyes with him, my stare unwavering and tranquil. "Dave, you do not have a very good understanding of the situation, in my opinion," I said, making sure to adopt a tone that did not waver in the firmness with which I expressed my opinion. He was visibly taken aback by my demeanor and the manner in which I talked. In fact, he was so surprised that he raised an eyebrow. "Would you be so kind as to provide more information regarding the meaning of your statement?" he said. "I think that you will come to realize this for yourself in no time at all," I replied. I walked over to the desk and took the paperwork that my husband had forgotten to retrieve from its place on the desk. I grabbed the folder, spun around in a circle, and then turned to face Dawn. "You might believe that you are depriving me of this building, this house, but you are mistaken in that assumption. It has never been a thing that was solely owned by me. Dawn, you have been making your rent payments to the wrong individual, he said. Her expression clearly conveyed that she was bewildered as she looked in my direction and commented, I do not consider myself to be a Titan, Gemini, or any other model. I am an artificial intelligence system that was created by a team of Amazon's inventors. Throughout the ordeal, she maintained her dignity, although her voice betrayed a little tremor when she asked the question. This is my house, the very one that you have been so incredibly excited to abandon. It has always been like that, she retorted. Her astonishment was palpable, and her behavior mirrored her bemusement. It felt as though she had been waiting for all of eternity, but now she opened her eyes, and it appeared that she was really listening for the first time. As I presented the papers that were in my possession, Dave's demeanor changed from arrogant to less self-assured. His line of sight went back and forth between me and the paperwork, and over the course of time, his complexion became absolutely devoid of color. The information that I had just disclosed to Dawn caused her to stand still in the same spot and tremble as she processed its significance. Dave, on the other hand, seemed to be genuinely upset. He had lost all of his self-confidence, and panic had taken its place. I had never seen him look that way before. The man who had entered my home with a look of smugness on his face, behaving as though he had everything under control, was no longer the same man. At this point in time, the situation had become inverted, and it was he who had assumed an attitude that was more defensive in nature. I was given the chance to take charge of the circumstances that were taking place. I cast a glance in Dawn's direction. Her complexion noticeably paled, and her eyes widened in disbelief. I was able to watch her as she took in and processed the knowledge that I had just imparted to her. I could see her mind working as she made an effort to understand everything. With a voice that was trembling, she approached me and looked me in the eyes as she spoke. Regardless of this, we have continued to make payments for the rental to the property management company. What situations could have played a role in this scenario that could have contributed to this particular result? I could sense the bewilderment in her eyes, and I could tell that she was in desperate need to make everything fit into place with the life that she had established with Dave. However, none of that was important at that particular point in time. I consistently exhibited a manner that was composed and peaceful when I made my announcement. Dawn, you have been paying your rent to a management company, and the money is deposited directly into my account. There is not a single point in time when I have been anything other than the person I am at this very moment. I am also the owner of the building in addition to that. Not a single person uttered a word throughout this period of time. Dawn did not have the ability to move from the position that she had been in before. She stayed in that position and even kept her mouth open slightly. She was making every attempt to fully understand the contents of what I was saying. She rapidly moved her eyes back and forth between me and the paperwork that I was holding, and it appeared as though she was attempting to determine whether or not I was being insincere. The information was not making sense to Dave in the same way that it was to the other students either. I was able to perceive the frantic measures that he was doing in an effort to extricate himself from this predicament, which he was performing in his mind. He carried on with the talk with a voice that was shaking as a result of the fact that he was not able to digest the information that was being presented to him audibly. There is no way all of this can be your property. That simply isn't fair, he stated in response. None of these documents are legitimate. That doesn't make any sense at all, he asserted to reporters. I could see the terror pouring into his eyes despite the fact that he was doing everything he could to retain some sort of control. This has to be a misunderstanding of some kind, he said. He had never employed a tone that was so much more reserved than any tone that I had ever heard him use before. His voice grew more louder and louder as he continued to speak without interruption. You have been surviving on a pension, Ma'am Maeve. There is no possibility that you could possibly be the owner of any of this. There is not a shred of sense in this at all. I have been unable to locate the precise item that you are looking for. I was aware of how serious his comments were, yet they no longer had any impact on me. I was already aware of his attempts to persuade me as well as his lies. The idea dawned on him that my strength was not very great. He had underestimated me and made the assumption that I was a frail, elderly woman who could be treated horribly and abandoned without a second thought. I had the power to achieve that at that particular point in time. In an effort to ensure that Dave could see the documents, I set them on the table and made the comment, "Everything is right here, Dave," in a measured manner. "Taking it away from me is something that I absolutely had no intention of letting you do," I stated emphatically. "You have not been giving yourself, or your capabilities, enough credit. All of the strategies that you have been implementing, as well as every single one of the actions that you have been carrying out, have been a waste of time. Now you will have to pay for this." I was completely focused on Dawn. I had the suspicion that the emotions that were present in her eyes were in direct opposition to one another. In particular, it appeared as though they were brimming with a mixture of bewilderment and humiliation. "Mother," she asked in a voice so quiet that it was barely perceptible above a whisper, "would you please explain to me how you were able to keep this secret from me?" Her query was more distressing than anything else. Whenever she needed me, I was always there. I have never let her down. I have made sacrifices for her time and again in the past, giving up my own time in favor of hers. I had the realization at that moment that the extent of her knowledge regarding me was rather limited. Unaware of the fact that I had made numerous sacrifices for her as well as for our family as a whole, she had no notion. What is the source of her knowledge on the subject? It was my notion that being a mother meant keeping everything locked up and buried under the surface. Therefore, that is exactly what I had always done. They protected their children from the challenging aspects of life, even the most terrible ones. At the conclusion, though, the only thing that it achieved was the creation of a wall between the two of us, a wall that I could no longer deny was there. I deliberately chose not to share the information with Dawn because I did not want her to be the one to have to deal with the consequences of it. I made every possible effort to keep her informed about this because I did not want her to be aware of the degree to which I compromised or of the things that I gave up in order to ensure that you would have a better life than I did. I had anticipated that you would be satisfied, and that is exactly what I had hoped would transpire. It was my view that you were going to be successful in your objective of becoming the owner of all of the material possessions that you desired. I was also convinced that it would be easier for you to live the life that you have yearned for your entire life if I were to keep this information secret from you. As I gazed at her, the young woman to whom I had devoted my entire life, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I have never been the sort of person who would place the needs of other individuals above my own desires. I was the one who made sure that she never lacked for anything at all. Even if that meant giving up everything for myself, I would do it. Despite this, I have reached the conclusion that I had inadvertently bestowed onto her the authority to become antagonistic toward me by acting in such a manner. It was my judgment that it was a good idea to enable her to be misled by Dave into the belief that I was the obstacle that was preventing her from having a life of happiness when, in reality, all I had ever done was put out the effort to provide her with the greatest possible existence. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to make a choice between him and me," I continued to explain, my voice trembling. "Since that time I have come to the conclusion that I was in the wrong. It was at that moment that I became suddenly and completely aware of the fact that I should have been advocating for myself and protecting my own interests. It is my duty to fight for your defense too, given the circumstances. For the fact that I let him become a part of our relationship in the first place, I sincerely apologize. I should have stopped him before he was able to convince you that I was the source of the problem." She reached out with hands that were shaking to collect the papers that had been left on the table. She quickly flipped through the documents, drying her tears as she scrutinized each piece of evidence with her eyes. Every piece of evidence corroborated what I had said. Her face was ashen, and her hands were shaking as she looked up at me. "I had no idea, Mother," she said in a whisper. Her voice carried a hint of regret. "I had no idea that he was treating you this way." "Dawn," I said in a subdued voice, "it is not too late yet. Regardless, you are going to have to make a decision. You must choose what kind of person you want to become in the future. Because you have been observing him over this entire period of time, you ended up being married to a man who is different from the one he is today. The man that you ended up marrying turned out to be different from the man he is now. The decision as to whether you wish to continue with the pretense that you have been perpetuating or if you want to face the truth of the circumstances is totally up to you." For a long time, Dawn had her attention fixed on me. Only two of the numerous emotions that were flitting about in her eyes were remorse and perplexity. I saw the woman who I had reared for the very first time. In the past, her eyes would shine with feelings of love and appreciation whenever she looked at me. That being said, I also witnessed the kind of woman she had become. She was the type of woman who had let other people to dominate and control her. The damage that had already been done was not going to be easy to repair, as I reluctantly discovered for myself. She whispered an apology to her mother, saying, "I'm sorry, Mom," after a significant amount of time had passed. Her voice was so low, however, that it was impossible to make out the words that she was attempting to express. "I am sorry for all of the events that have occurred," she said. "I am the person who should have prohibited him from doing this because it is something that he should not have done. I am the person who should have taken action. I ought to have never abandoned you like that." I am unsure of what to say in response. All of the events that had occurred continued to be just as terrible as they had been in the past, and they had not yet found a solution to their suffering. I must say, though, that I came to the conclusion at that particular point in time that the path that I had ahead of me would not be an easy one to follow. There was no possibility that it would occur in the span of a few minutes. At the very least, people were optimistic throughout this specific point in time. I am optimistic that we will be able to come across it again and that we will be able to devise a plan that will enable us to address the damage that has been caused. I addressed Dawn and said, "I understand that," in a tone of voice that communicated a feeling of certainty. While I was still speaking, I continued to experience feelings of sorrow in my heart because I was overwhelmed with regret. A significant amount of time will be necessary for this. A great deal of effort will be essential. In order to rebuild, there is a large amount of items that we are going to need. We set out on our expedition, which was not without its difficulties by any means. The path that lay before us was lengthy, and it was fraught with moments of hesitation and uncertainty. I was resolved to continue on that path in spite of this fact. When the situation had reached its conclusion, I was cognizant of the fact that I had retained my dignity. Despite the fact that we had become separated, I still possessed the ability to protect myself and my family. I had also held on to my strength, and my feelings for my family had not changed.